Hello and welcome. Ruairi here, WWX developer at Finsweet, and in this session we take a look at how we can export a Webflow site and turn it into a web app. This is a bit more of a technical project, and in this session we're just doing a kind of overview of it from a high level. There'll be a tutorial later on. It looks at a unique case we had with a client who wanted a Webflow app but needed to host it internally on their own servers on premises. So we look at how we can export the site, load it into a local web server using Hono.js and Node.js, connect it up to a database to replicate or replace the Webflow CMS, and build it out into a Webflow app. Let's get started.
Finsweet. Agency, product, community. That's effing sweet.
So hello and welcome again, everybody. In today's session, we're going to look at building traditional web apps with a Webflow front end. So, quick overview of some terminology. Traditional development. This used to just be called development, and then low-code came along and we needed a new phrase. So traditional development is developing without low-code tools. You're typically in a code editor like VS Code for the majority of the time, working with any number of languages, Java, JavaScript, Node.js, PHP. And that differs to low-code development, which is probably what most people here are familiar with. So that's developing with low-code tools that involve some coding to differentiate it from no code. If you build a Webflow website without writing any custom code, you can call that no code. If you write any amount of code in the custom code in the header or footer of a site or a page, an individual page, you're into low code development. WYSD, we used to refer to as no code, but the way that's grown, it's unusual that you'd ever do a WYSD project without some amount of code, so hence we call that a low-code tool. Same with Xano, which is what we typically use as the backend for our web apps. You can write code in there. They're called Lambda functions, where you can type and execute JavaScript. So the project we're looking at today is a traditional web app, we'd call it, because it's mostly done with traditional development. As we'll see, there is some low code just because we use Webflow. Some other terms then. Front end, we use to refer to the part of a web app that users interact directly with. That's the UI, facing the user experience, what gets loaded into their browser, typically made up of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And that differs from the backend, which is the server-side part of the web app that handles data processing, business logic. So that's things like databases, endpoints, tasks that run regularly. Webflow handles all that backend stuff for us. There's a whole backend that lets Webflow do what it does. That's all done on AWS, Amazon Web Services. Typically, we're just working with building a front end inside of Webflow. For low code, Webflow is your front end. Xano or Supabase is your backend, and WYSD is essentially linking the two of those together. And a full stack developer we'd use to refer to a developer who can do both. So if you've ever built a WWX project, you can call yourself a full stack developer, or I guess the full title would be a full stack low code developer. Bit of a mouthful, but that's what it is. Headless CMS we'll be looking at. This is a CMS that is separated from the front end. It allows you to manage content and its structure, but it doesn't control how you present it to the user. So it essentially lets you store all your data in one place and then pull it into whatever front end you're working with. Examples would be Sanity, Strapi, to name two of the more popular ones. Contentful is another one. And we have SSH, which is Secure Shell Protocol. It's a way to securely send commands to a server. We'll get into that a bit more, but this is how I connected to the client project that I was working with for this particular use case. I'm going to just talk a little bit about myself because it's relevant to my career progression and hence potentially your career progression. So, you know my name, Ruairi, 27 years old, Irish, living in Ireland. Now, I originally started as a freelance WordPress builder. And I say builder because I was not a developer. I was doing what some of you may have done to get your career started. I was launching WordPress websites, to use to Webflow, and basically just adding in plugins until it did what the client wanted. I could not write code initially. I couldn't even write PHP to work with WordPress. And I eventually got into Webflow freelancing. Round about that time, I had a go at traditional development. I tried out PHP with a framework called Laravel, and I just couldn't stick to the coding side of things, which bothered me because I loved the idea of building web apps, and I was very good at planning them and doing out the pseudo code, which is where you basically write out in English how the app is going to work and what it does. So I parked that for a little bit and then discovered Wiz when it was in 1.0 before Finsweet acquired it. And that really struck a note with me. That really seemed like something I could get into. So I started upskilling in it and figuring out how to use Webflow, Wiz, and Xano. And that led me to joining Finsweet and becoming a WWX developer. So what I'm going to be showing you in this session is a traditional web app that I built for a client as part of my work. And because I got that done, I can now call myself a beginner or a junior full stack developer. Now, the point here that will hopefully be useful to you is that if you can do low-code web apps, you can get into full stack development. And doing low-code first is what made it possible for me to get into this. Because when I looked at the brief for this job, I knew that if this was a WWX job, I'd be able to do it. I knew how to build the logic. I knew how to set up the database, the API endpoints. I had done jobs for clients that were more complex than this, but using WWX. So I figured if I can do it with those tools, I can do it without those tools. Now, I did have very good support from our CTO, Alex Iglesias, who gave me a lot of pointers here. He was the one that worked out the structure for this project and what to use. And I also had a lot of help from ChatGPT, quite a bit. But, you know, that's the world we're in today. If GPT is the difference between you being able to do a job and not being able to do it, absolutely do it or use it. Now, do be careful how you use ChatGPT. I lost a couple of hours, or I spent a couple of hours on this project trying to debug an issue, and that wouldn't have happened if I had been reading through the code that ChatGPT gave me and trying to understand it. It basically just added in one line at the end that was breaking the app because it doesn't always get it right. And I thought I had done something wrong. It took me a long time to debug. So the lesson I learned from that is do pay attention. Don't just get it to write the code and slap it into the app and cross your fingers and pray that it works. It does work 90% of the time, but that last percent of the time can catch you and you can lose time debugging that you mightn't have lost if you had paid more attention. So if you're doing low-code development or if you're looking at getting into it, it is probably the best path for you to get in to full-stack development. So if you've done that, everything that I'm going to go through here, as complicated as it might look, you will be able to work out with a little bit of help from ChatGPT or even just Stack Overflow, reading what other people have done online. So into the project. Here is the challenge that came across my plate one morning. So we have a client who wanted to use Webflow for their website. They needed a CMS and they needed some backend functionality, sending form submissions to a database, sending emails, doing some filtering on the website. Very straightforward stuff. The problem is that this client was based in Germany, and it's quite a big company. We presented Webflow, Wiz, and Xano, and their legal team came back and said that we couldn't host anything outside of Germany. So I thought, fine, Xano has the ability to be hosted on premises. Legal team came back and said we can't use any tools that are operated by non-German companies. Now, they were okay with using Webflow to build the front end, but we had to export the code and host it somewhere else. First problem there is the CMS. Exporting a Webflow site, hosting it elsewhere, very easy to do if you're not using the CMS. Very handy tool for that is Netlify. They provide a free plan for what's called static hosting, where you basically just export your Webflow site, throw it into Netlify, and you have a site. You link up the domain, works out of the box. The problem is everything else, CMS, the backend functionality. So all of that had to be hosted on their own internal servers. We call that on-premises or on-prem, meaning that they have a server, they control it, they manage it, everything had to live there. Now, we did use the Webflow CMS to initially build the site and to show it to them on the staging domain because they wanted to be able to view this on the staging domain initially, but the end website had to be hosted internally on their own servers. So how do you tackle a challenge like that? Well, the first thing is just discovery or research. Has anyone else on our team done this before? No, in our case. If not, can anyone give advice or direction? The answer there was yes. We have Alex, our CTO. We have JavaScript developers who have done similar work and could help me with the JavaScript code. So it was possible to do with our current team and resources. But when you start working outside the capabilities of Webflow, you do have to ask, is this desirable or feasible to do? Can we do this in a way that it's going to be useful for the client, that they're not going to be having to do really roundabout ways of updating their site, of, making changes, of managing this for the long term? They're going to have this website, this web app for a very long time. We decided that it was. We went with this method. And what will the client do or provide for us to execute this project? So in this case, they were going to set up the server, they were going to install everything on it, give me access, and I could take it from there. So in doing this research, ask ChatGPT, ask senior people on your team, look for articles, blog posts online where people have done this before, or Stack Overflow posts on similar setups. The Webflow subreddit and the web development subreddit on Reddit are quite good for asking these kind of questions. So do what it takes to make sure you're confident in your mind that this can be done in a good way. Then planning. What tools and platforms are we going to use? How do we make Webflow fit into this use case? How do we use it for what it's good at while still being able to meet the client's needs? How are all the moving parts going to fit together? We're going to be looking at that quite a bit. And how will launching and maintaining the site differ from a usual Webflow workflow? As you'll see as we get into this, there's a very different way of managing this. We just need to be aware of that, explain it to the client, and see, are they happy with it? Which brings us on to step 3, which is just discussing this with the client. This is a different enough job that it was important to tell them, to tell their IT guy what our plan was and make sure that they have the team and resources needed to make this work. To check with them the pros and cons lists that we made of this approach. The pro is that it fits into their needs. It's relatively straightforward to manage once it gets off the ground. The main con is just every time they update something in Webflow, they're exporting it and they're moving it onto their server. So they were happy with the pros and cons list. They were happy that they had the team and the resources to make this work. We went ahead and got into the building. So a lot of this tech stack came from one client had available to them and were happy to use, and to what Alex Iglesias, our CTO, recommended to me. So you don't have to work this all out yourself. It's a little trickier, obviously, if you're a freelancer. You have to do a lot of the research yourself. If you are on any sort of team, talk to them and see if there's anyone that can guide you along with this. So for Webflow, front end is being built on Webflow, same as normal. And for the CMS, as I said, we created collection lists as usual, just to prototype it, to get it off the ground quickly, to demo it to the client in the staging domain. And what we then did was we duplicated those collection lists, or not duplicated, rather what we did, if you're familiar with the collection list, you have your collection list, your collection item, we replicated those as static elements. So they were just div blocks that had the same classes as those collection lists. And each of those got a custom attribute, as you'll see later on, and that was used to duplicate those. So if we had a CMS item of, say, blog posts, and we have 5 of those in a database, that template will be replicated 5 times and that information brought in. We'll get into that a little further down. So when changes are made, the Webflow site gets exported. And a very important restraint here was that you can't import changes into Webflow. That is a one-way relationship. You export your code out. If you change any of that code, you can't import it back in. You would have to manually make those changes in Webflow. So all the functionality that we created in this site was written with JavaScript. So we have a diagram for this later on, but we have the Webflow files that get imported. Those never get touched. There's JavaScript that works with those files, pulls in the dynamic data from our external CMS, can't make any changes directly to those files. Now, we can change them with JavaScript, and we do a lot of that, but those Webflow files get downloaded, get put onto the server, and they don't get changed. We then needed a CMS. We went with Strapi CMS. Why? Our CTO recommended it. I wasn't super familiar with these headless CMSs, so Alex was. He suggested it, looked at it, thought it was a good use case. So did Alex. So that got used for basically replacing the Webflow CMS. And again, we'll look at all of these in a bit further detail. That was displaying content. It was also used to store form submissions. So then what the client has is they have a web server physically on their premises that they manage, and that runs Node.Js, which is a JavaScript runtime environment, which is a fancy way of saying it's a backend that runs with JavaScript. That's part of what made JavaScript so popular, is the fact that it can be used for the front end and the back end. And they also set up MySQL for us, which is a type of database. So the web server is running Node.js and MySQL. We then have Hono. You might not have heard of that. You might be a bit familiar with Express.js. Hono is a web application framework. So it's basically what's in charge of taking our Webflow files, manipulating them, and serving them to the user that is visiting the website. So we have MySQL as well, a database. Strapi basically sits on top of MySQL. It doesn't actually store any data. It's kind of like the editor or the CMS inside the Webflow designer. It's where you can create your collection types and you can add content into them. And finally, we had an SMTP server to send emails. So we have a nice big chart here. Looks a little complicated, and that's because it kind of is. What most of us will be used to is just this Webflow. And, you know, maybe we have Wiz down here and we have Xano down at the bottom. This is a bit more complicated. So let's look at it. So these are kind of grouped together with these gray boxes. So we have the user's browser, we have Webflow over here. This big one is everything that's running on the client server. And over here, we have my laptop. So what the client provided was SSH information. So this is an IP address to connect to with the username and a password. So I open my terminal application. I use a very good one called Warp on Mac. It's free. It's better than the stock terminal app, integrates with AI, and every morning when I was starting work on this, I would connect to their server via SSH. And now from my little terminal, I can access and control everything that you see here. So this is the client's web server, also represented by this big gray box. So we have Node.js, which is the JavaScript runtime environment and is basically what allows Strapi and Hono to work. These are JavaScript tools. We need a JavaScript runtime environment to get those to work. So Strapi and Hono both run on Node.js. Strapi is a CMS, and we'll go down here to take a quick look at it. This is what it looks like. Very similar to the Webflow CMS. It basically does the exact same thing, but it looks a little different. So it has a content type builder, which is similar to creating or editing CMS types in Webflow. And it looks like this. Again, very similar. You can create all these different fields. This is a text field. This is an ID. This is an enum field, which is, basically like a select field. It gives you pre-selected options. Start date, end date. That's where we build out these content types. So we had partners, which was just a list of their partners, their logo on their website. We had blog posts. We had downloadable PDFs. So our Webflow designer created all this initially in Webflow. I just had to go in to each CMS collection and replicate those in here. Nice and simple. And then I went into the content manager, which you can see up the left here. That's the same as going in and adding or editing posts in Webflow. And I moved over the content into here. So there we have the CMS part replicated. Strapi has an API you can use to add and retrieve information. I decided to just write SQL directly. So if a user goes onto a page that needs to get a list of blog posts, there's an SQL query that says, go to the blog post table, pull them all down. The JavaScript then on the Hono web app server basically just says, if they're for each row, so if there's 10 rows, we need to find this div block that's on the page, which I did with the custom attribute, very similar to Wiz. So instead of, Wiz equals blog card, I just called it Strapi. Strapi equals blog card. For every one of those, you're going to duplicate it out. You're going to pull in the information from the database row. So, the title element gets updated with the title. And again, most of that I did with ChatGPT because I'm very good at pseudocode, prompting it, saying, I need to do this, 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 this. It gives me JavaScript. I check through it, make some tweaks here and there, and get it working. So that's Strapi. That's the replacement for the Webflow CMS. Hono is the web app framework. And if a user goes onto a page that we need to get CMS content for, there's just some JavaScript that says, hey, I need to get this from the database and I need to display it on the page. Similarly, if a user fills out a form, there's some JavaScript in Hono that collects that form information and stores it over in Strapi. So, Hono, a web application framework similar to Express.js. Again, I had never heard of this. I had not come across this, and it was recommended for use by our CTO, Alex, because it's built using modern web standards, which Express.js is not. So it's a bit more robust. The disadvantage is that because it's newer, there's less documentation, there's less plugins in the ecosystem, there's less experienced users that you can ask questions of. But because this was a fairly straightforward project, we decided to use it, and it worked very well. Hono.dev is the website address. So this serves the Webflow site as static files. So there's a very simple piece of code down here, which goes to a folder. So this is a screenshot from their website. Mine just basically said root/Webflow. So I had a folder on the server called Webflow. I would export the Webflow site, unzip it, drop those files in there, and that got 90% of the job done. Now, when we go to the web app, It serves our Webflow site. If we click any of the links, it works. It brings us to that page. The majority of what you export out of Webflow is going to work. The only thing that didn't work for us was those Lottie file paths. Everything else that our Webflow developer built, the animations, the scroll interactions, all worked perfectly out of the box. So then we needed to add some functionality. I noticed that when we got this up and running, whenever you went to a page, so if you went to the FAQ page, in the bar, it said FAQ.html, which is not how people expect websites to work. We always remove those. So there was a little bit of JavaScript to do that. Most of the JavaScript was going to the database, pulling in the content and rendering it on the page using a tool called NodeHTML parser that basically pulls in your HTML file, edits it how you want, in this case, pulling in content from the CMS, and then serves that back to the user. Handling form submissions, storing the database, and sending emails. We used Node Mailer for that. So you pop in your SMTP server info, which the client provided, put in who the email needs to go to, the body, the subject, nice and easy sending emails. Some things obviously are an advantage over Webflow. So Webflow doesn't let you send different forms to different users, which was something we did have to do here. So that was a benefit of having to host the site externally, is that we could do things like that. Otherwise, we'd have had to have used an external email service with Webflow to take care of that. So that was a nice benefit. 404 errors, Hono handles those, but we had to tell it where the 404 page was, nice and simple. And then just some simple filtering. And I was very pleased to see that the Finsweet attribute for CMS filtering almost worked out of the box. We had to change it a tiny bit. It was basically missing a Webflow class that I had to add in, and then it just worked out of the box on an external site, which is great. So the majority, if not all, of Finsweet attributes will work. They might need a little bit of tweaking, but they should work on externally hosted websites. So that's Hono. It's serving the Webflow site files, and it's using JavaScript to do all of these things. So back up to our diagram. So all of this is living on the client's web server. Hono and Strapi are running on Node.js. We have a MySQL database over here. So when you install Strapi, you have the option to do a custom install, which you should do. If you do their default installation, it uses MySQL Lite, which isn't suitable for production. So instead of having to move that over, do a custom install. It'll ask you for the MySQL database details. And when you provide those, Strapi is going to create a table in the MySQL database. And then every time I add a new collection type or post type, content type, as they're called in Strapi, Strapi is automatically going to create a new table in MySQL. That's basically what Strapi does. It sits on top of the MySQL database and does all of that work for you. There was also a SMTP server, as I mentioned. So whenever a form was filled out, there was some JavaScript in Hono that said to the SMTP server, hey, send an email to this address with this subject and this body. Nice and simple. Webflow is one way, as denoted by that arrow. You package the zip, you download it, and you pull it into Hono. So the way I was working for the majority of this project is VS Code, which is a code editor, has the ability to connect to a server over SSH. So when I first started out, I was working locally and I had to zip the project. I had to upload it to the server. I had to unzip it. If I changed a file locally, I had to manually update it because I'm new to all this. Remember, I was a low-code developer up until 3-4 weeks ago. So went online and, did some digging. Very easy to connect VS Code. So when I was working in VS Code, I'd pop in the SSH info, and on the left-hand side where you get your folders and files, instead of displaying what I had opened up locally, it was working directly on the server. So whenever I updated a file or changed it in VS Code, it was updating immediately on the client server. So if I was updating my index.js file in Hono, which is where all of my logic lived, I just click save and it updated automatically. And then finally, the user's browser. So they go to the web address, Hono does its thing, it grabs the Webflow files. If they're on a page with dynamic content, it pops that in and it sends that all off to the user's browser. Nearly at the end, folks, there's basically just 2 other slides. We set up a package on Node.js called PM2. And if you ever end up doing anything with Node.js, this is very useful. It's an advanced process manager. And basically it does a couple of things. We have 2 processes running on our Node.js setup. We have Strapi and we have Hono. So PM2 is just a way of managing those processes. If Hono crashed for some reason, it'll email the client and attempt to restart it. It's an easy way to log any errors. It lets you set up watch and reload. So previously, whenever I changed the JavaScript, I had to stop Hono and I had to restart it. This lets you watch it or hot reload, where if you make a change, it updates automatically. I was also running into an issue because I'm new to this, where every time I closed the terminal on my Mac, Hono would stop and Strapi would stop. So the answer to all of those problems was PM2, very simple to set up and install. I asked ChatGPT a couple of questions about how to best set it up. And yeah, very handy for production level apps. The last thing was just client set up staging domains for us to access Strapi and to access Hono to do the testing. When they're ready to go live, obviously there's a different process. We're not going to be adding a domain in Webflow. We're not going to be pointing name servers to Webflow. The client is basically going to take care internally on their end, setting up live URLs for Strapi so that their team can go in and edit the CMS, and for updating or for accessing the website itself, accessing Hono. And whenever they make changes in Webflow, or if Kai make changes in Webflow, he'll let me know. I'll export it, drop it in, and we have our new website. Whoa, that's all, folks. That was a bit of a roller coaster. Putting this together, building this was a roller coaster, but it was a fantastic learning experience for me. This got me from a low-code developer to a full-stack developer. A beginner one, right? I still need Alex, I still need ChatGPT, but now that I have this foundation, I can work on improving it and, being able to do more work with, less bothering Alex and less asking ChatGPT. And that's all, folks, for this high-level overview of exported Webflow apps. There'll be a tutorial to follow in the future. Thanks for watching. If you have any suggestions for future videos, please drop a comment below. Subscribe to the channel to get the latest technical Webflow videos, and see you again soon.